All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hi, y'all. I'm Greg Boggs. I'm a Drupal developer with the Multnomah County Library here in Portland, Oregon. And I'm a longtime Drupal contributor. I maintain the Easy Breadcrumb module for Drupal 8 and 9. And I like to play a lot of chess on Lee Chess, really terrible chess. My rating's about 1,400 on a good day. If you ever want to play a game with me, hit me up. Sounds like fun. Today, we're going to talk about configuration workflow for Drupal. I'm going to give a short introduction of what configuration is and what configuration management is. I'm betting that most of us already know that, but if there's someone in the room or watching the video who doesn't know a lot about configuration or isn't super clear on the concept, I want to make sure they've got a chance to follow along, the same as those of us who do know what configuration is. Sorry, I'm just switching my mouse. After I talk about what configuration is, I'm going to walk us through the current options for workflow, including the ones that everybody is using. And then I'm going to pivot to the one that I use and the one that I think everyone, including you, should be using in your projects. And that is, of course, automation. So first, what is configuration? As the slide says, configuration is a collection of settings that determine how the site functions, and that's different than content. Content is not configuration. Content is the actual written words of the website on the page. Configuration can also store strings or paragraphs of text, but in general, configuration controls what the site does and how it works, and content is the information that the website is presenting. An example of configuration would be your site name, or interestingly, a menu. But not a menu item, I don't believe. I believe menu items are content. So how does configuration work in Drupal? You make a config change in a form. You export the config to the file system. You save your work to Git. Usually, most of us have some sort of file management system with version control or some storage system where we're saving our work. You then copy or deploy your work to a web server. And if your database is different than your coworker's database or the original database from the site, the configuration that you've added may have a different UUID. So you have to fix the site UUID in your configuration, and then you can import that configuration into production. So a visual representation from Mike Anello of that workflow. Configuration is stored in the database in Drupal 8 and then cached before being used. The reason for that is to improve the performance of reading the configuration. So it starts in your local database. You run either web-based buttons in the form to export it, or you use Drush. And Drush is the command line tool for Drupal, and you type this command and it will export the configuration into a file format called YAML or YML. Those are in your local file system or in the file system of the server if you're working on a server. And then we save that to a Git repository, and then In the remote Git repository, we then pull down those YAML files with a git pull, and those then get imported into the production database with a drush config import. And then those go into the database in production in the active configuration storage or the configuration table. So the config is stored in YAML files, except that Drupal does not read the YAML files directly when checking the configuration of the site. It reads the configuration from the database using a database storage table, which is basically a direct copy of the YAML files into a database table. So that means that we actually have two configuration storages in Drupal, the sync storage and the active storage. The sync is the file folder on your file system where the YAML files live. The active configuration is where the configuration is actually used by Drupal in the database table. So there's some drawbacks to this system. Number one, configuration is stored in the database, which means it's a little more difficult to review your changes, to pass those changes around, and to share them with your coworkers. It's also not easy to edit the configuration because it's in a database table. The other thing that isn't super easy is that you can't take configuration from your site and ship it to another site and reuse it. But the big drawback that can hang folks up is that the configuration must go through the import step. And you might skip the import step. For example, if you just copied the configuration into the database directly, or tried to use the old file-based configuration management system that originally came with Drupal 8, or if your workflow somehow gets into a state where your import fails. Drupal has a lot of validation in the configuration system to try and prevent you from getting into a state where your configuration was not imported before being used. And the reason those exist is because if the import step is skipped, then bad things happen to your database. And the reason for this is that configuration is responsible for managing your database schema changes. And what I mean by that is the names of columns, the types of columns, the various elements in the database that describe the data stored by Drupal. And that is changed when your configuration changes. But that change actually happens on the configuration import step. So it's not good enough that you just have those changes listed in the configuration files. Drupal actually has to run them through that import step. So our goals are to keep our configuration in files or code, because files are easier to copy and move around and to share with other people, to edit and to compare. We want to keep our code in sync with the active configuration in the database at all times. Generally, the configuration in the YAML file system and the configuration in the database, we want those two to be the same. If they're out of sync, it means that the site that you're looking at when you're browsing Drupal in the web browser is not running the same configuration that you have in your pending configuration sync directory. So if your coworker, for example, builds a view for you or edits a view for you to fix something, and you're reviewing their work and you did a git pull, so you have their code, but you haven't run a configuration import, you won't have that view that they built to go along with their work, and things are going to be broken until you do that configuration import. We also want to deploy configuration across multiple environments, dev, test, live. We want to be able to merge our configuration into production, because if you've got some new work and you want to add it to production, there might also be different configuration in production. and we want to kind of make sure we can push those things together. And then sometimes if you build something super useful, you want to reuse that work and share it with other people or other sites that you're working on. So in Drupal, it comes with one option for configuration, the Drupal UI for configuration synchronization. This is a user interface that allows you to export configuration, either one item at a time or the entire site configuration. It will give you a zip file called a tarball, and you can take that tarball, go to another site, and upload that tarball into the configuration system. This is a manual web interface that allows you to install configuration. Sometimes if you're in a state where production is a little bit wonky and you need to make a single line configuration change, the Drupal UI will allow you to do that. You can create the configuration that you want in your development environment and then paste that configuration into the UI and insert the configuration. But I do not recommend editing your configuration with a single item. And I don't recommend using the Drupal configuration synchronization UI unless you're super new and it's really your first experience with Drupal. The way that almost everyone manages their configuration workflow is with Drush, with those commands that we saw in the previous slide, which I'll go back to briefly. The Drush configuration import command and the Drush configuration export command. The export command takes the configuration out of the database and puts it into your configuration synchronization folder, which is in Sites default by default, or Sites default files by default. But you can also put it anywhere you want by changing the settings in the settings.php file, and you can store those usually at the top of your project next to your web root, because they don't need to be accessible to the website through the browser. And then configuration import, Drush config import takes the pending changes in your file system and installs them in the database. And there is a third way to manage your configuration, and that is to let Drupal manage it for you so that you don't have to worry about running these commands. Here's a detail of the commands that you would be typing every single time you change Drupal's configuration and you want to save your work. You do the configuration export command from your local, you do a git commit, you do a push, and then you go to the production server and you do your git pull, and then you import that config. So I said we're here to automate. So I wrote a module called Config Suite, which you can find on Drupal.org, and I added a link in the chat. And what Config Suite does is it automates configuration import on page load, and it automates config import when you save a form that changes configuration. It does this through the Drupal event system. So when Drupal changes configuration, it fires an event. And we listen for that event and we update the config synchronization folder. Both of these features are optional. You can use one or the other or both on any environment you want. So in your local environment, for example, you might use both so that your configuration is always in sync. But in production, you might be a little bit uncomfortable with production automatically exporting configuration, for example, because maybe production doesn't have the permissions to write to the configuration synchronization folder. And then the third feature there that Config Suite has is that I disable the check for site UUID. So that if your UUID is different because you have a local install that's a different database than the production database, it will allow you to install the configuration without throwing the validation error. So what are the advantages of this approach? The number one advantage is that your config files are never out of sync with your configuration in the database. You're never going to be in a state where your coworker gave you some work and you didn't install all of their work. Automatically, when you load the browser with Drupal, when you load Drupal in the browser, it's going to check that config folder. And if sync has changed, it's going to install the changes for you. And this avoids breaking your site with configuration mismatch problems. And it makes sure that you're always working with the correct configuration. If you run these commands by hand, you have to always remember to run that configuration import, because configuration import is required to maintain your database schema. And if you're working with coworkers and you've got multiple branches in your project, every single time you change a branch to look at your coworker's branch, you need to run that configuration import command. And if you don't, your development environment may end up just completely busted. So to prevent it from white screening or just displaying the wrong behavior, we always want to run that import. It also just saves you a ton of typing. Going to the command line and running the import is something that you do many times. The other thing that can happen if you're doing your deploy process by hand is that when you're doing that deploy process, you might actually forget to run that configuration import command, and that's very bad because that production can be broken. In the configuration export side of things, if you are working on something and you want to deploy it, and your work has some configuration that goes along with it, you almost never want to forget to export your work and make sure it gets saved to your repository. It's actually very easy to forget to run that export command. And if that happens, then you go and deploy that to production, and then production is going to be broken again because you forgot the export command. And I think a lot of folks would just go, "Oh, I forgot to run that command." But if this is a command that you're kind of running all day long, every time you work on a Drupal site, human error is going to happen. So if we use Drupal to automate it, you're never going to forget to export. In fact, it's just a command that you don't have to worry about. As you work on the site, it's just exporting as you go. And if you do a git commit, it's going to have your configuration in it. So why isn't everyone super comfortable switching over to Config Suite and having Drupal manage their configuration? So when you're doing the process by hand, using Drush, you have an extra step that you're doing manually that gives you a chance to review the import on import. And some developers like to check their work when they're doing the import. The other thing is that if you're changing your configuration in your local and it's automatically exporting for you, it's saving your work as you go, even if you want to throw away that work. So some developers want the ability to not export their configuration just because they don't want to use that configuration. But if you're in that state, you still, you have to get your local site back to the way it was at some point if you want to not use that configuration so that you can indeed export configuration. And then I think that the next piece to this is people feel a little bit unsettled with the idea that production is automatically importing and exporting configuration to the file system. I would argue that if you've changed the sync folder in production, where the configuration is waiting to be installed, there's almost never a case where you don't want that configuration installed in the site. But I can certainly understand why people would want that production process to be a manual process where they want to check each step very carefully. And so that's why these options in Config Suite are optional. You can use them in your local environment. You can use one or the other, or both. If you have questions, now would be a good time to ask. And then I'm just going to do a little bit about merging into production, and then I'm going to jump into the code just very briefly to talk about what's coming next for Config Suite, because Drupal 9 has made some key changes to configuration. So I need to do a new release of Config Suite to support the latest version of Drupal 9. So the last piece to your configuration is merging into production. But before I get to that, Chris has asked a question. Can either option, auto import export, be disabled to just use part of the module's features? Would be useful for me personally just to auto export. And the answer, Chris, is yes. Each configuration option, import and export, is an optional feature. And there's just a config screen that comes with Config Suite that you turn one or both on or off. You can also combine it with the config split module, which allows you to install different configuration in different environments so that you can have it turned on in one environment and not another environment, so that you could use it in your dev server but not production. Personally, I use the export and import both in my local environment when I'm building Drupal sites, and then I use the auto export on production, so that when people are changing production, that work actually gets exported to the configuration file system, rather than just leaving pending work only in the database. And why that is because we want to merge work into production. So the last piece of the workflow is adding your work to production. Now, if you have a complex dynamic site, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that menus are in fact configuration, but site editors want to be able to change the title of your menu. The other piece is that blocks are stored in the configuration system. I think maybe the content inside the block is content, but like the block title, that would be configuration. And position of the block on the page would be configuration. And site editors are going to be changing that stuff all the time. So you've got this state where there's configuration in production that's different than what you have stored in your code repository. So before you add any work to a project, before you deploy anything, you have to export the production configuration and merge that into your new work, and then save all of that, and then deploy that to production. What that means is the work that you've been working on is actually different than what's going to go into production because of that merge. So whenever you're going to do testing, you should always merge production configuration into your development environment first with your latest work together before doing your testing. That way you're testing with the actual configuration from production merged with your work. If you do your testing first and there's some sort of issue with the difference between what's in production and your work, then you're not going to notice that when you do your testing. So there's a couple of ways to do it. There's a drush command, drush config pull, which will take the configuration out of the active storage and pull it to your local site. You can also download that through the UI, or you can go into the server with drush and do a config export and then save that work. This is a little bit of the place where it's a little bit freeform as to how it works and what workflow developers are using. The workflow that I recommend is that you enable automatic export. And that you use a module called config read only. Let me back up just a little bit, and to clarify, when I'm talking about merging into production, you've got a dev site, a test site, and a live site. So your live site will have pending stuff in it, and you've got to merge your stuff from development up into production. And so I recommend turning config read-only on in production. That way, folks cannot change configuration in production. And if a site editor wants to change configuration, I have them do that on the dev site. That might be a concept new to some site editors, but I think really the two common use cases are menus and blocks. And once your site editors get used to making those changes in development, they also get used to kind of reviewing the page in development and then pushing it up to production. If you're using one of the popular Drupal hosting companies, they all come with tools for pushing your work from dev to production. So as your editor makes those changes in dev and then they're exported to the file system, if you're on one of those Drupal hosting companies, they'll give them buttons or a workflow process where a non-technical user can actually deploy stuff to production. The other option is to use config ignore for blocks and menus, so that editors can change that and the changes are ignored. And that way you don't have to worry about the merge for those two types of items, just because we know the editors are going to be changing those often. The important piece here is that you just want to make sure you're always getting those changes out of production. I think I've explained that well enough. To be honest, it really is the trickiest part of the whole workflow, especially if you're letting your editors edit in production and change your configuration in production. It's just kind of the Drupal way. And I think most, if not almost all Drupal sites are letting site editors edit the configuration directly in production. And if you get super stuck, you can download the production database and the whole thing into your local and kind of recover that way. But you should only get stuck if you do something that breaks the configuration validation. An example of how you might get into trouble is if you manually edit the configuration files yourself and make a mistake. So I definitely recommend either using an automated tool or sticking with Drush and using the Drupal forms to edit your configuration and not editing them manually. Because the configuration system is a little bit brittle in that if you get that YAML file even slightly wrong, you can break your Drupal site, and recovering it is surprisingly challenging. If you get into a really tough spot, you might actually have to edit the active configuration in the database to fix a mistake. And that is configuration workflow. Thanks, everybody, for coming. And now let me know if you have more questions. And before I wrap up today, I do want to say that there are a couple of small changes that are needed for Drupal 9. If you're interested in configuration automation or using Config Suite, there's actually another smaller module that does just the automation of export. So I'm probably going to deprecate my code and use their config export code instead of mine, just because theirs is a little bit more robust, and they're maintaining that, so I can leverage their work that way. But I do need a couple of updates for Drupal 9. They made 2 small API changes to the configuration API. And the last piece is there is a bug in configuration export with dependencies. So if you're making a configuration export where you need to export the configuration and some dependencies, the example is deleting a block needs to export more than just the block. So thanks for coming to my session. And if you want to help out, I'd love to see you in the Config Suite issue queue. Thanks, everybody.